Hey, it worked. Hello, everybody. My name is Helen Millar, and this is Head to Heart Living. This channel is all about how to shift from living a life based only from your mind to one down from your heart. So moving away from a life sponsored by fear to one fueled by love, and navigating all your decisions so they make you happier and you live without regrets, essentially. This video is all about a new way of looking at grief. Now, grief happens to everybody, and it doesn't just happen when people die. I want to talk to you about having experienced a lot of grief in my life through people dying, but also various things not going my way, things ending and falling away in very sudden and shocking circumstances, so that the grief has come very left field. And during this process of not wanting to run, not being able to run away from these feelings and this thing called grief, I found some really interesting and, what's more important, really helpful ways of looking at what grief is, so that you can navigate your way through it with less suffering and more understanding. So if you're joining me live, it's lovely to have you here. Please put any questions in the chat. And likewise, if you're joining me on the repeat, please put your questions below and I will get back to you. Now, I don't believe personally grief is an emotion. Grief has so many faces. It affects us so differently, and it comes in waves. And also because I believe all time is now, you can experience grief 20 years after the event or whatever the trigger has happened, because we are constantly dropping into those times and places within our lives. So why now grief is often considered to be it's only really grief like when you're crying under the duvet or you're weeping at the side of a grave or something like that. Grief does not just come in tears. You can suddenly get struck by a memory of something that is no longer with you, a relationship, a job, an experience, a loved one, and be laughing about it. You can experience grief as anger, as frustration, as resentment. There are many different, and there is no good or bad way to grieve. When my mum died suddenly, I remember at the funeral, I was in quite an ecstatic mood, and lots of people for months afterwards, lots of people were were kind of giving me serious talkings to about not access, essentially saying I wasn't accessing the grief, but not accessing grief because I wasn't crying all the time, because I wasn't sad all the time. I felt a huge release of energy and felt very happy for quite a while after my mum passed away. And this is for many reasons, but I never felt guilty about it. And I've had plenty of time crying, and I knew in myself that I wasn't denying her death, and I wasn't avoiding feeling any of the more unpleasant, the darker, deeper experiences. I've spent a long time experiencing things like that from other grief that I'd had in my life. So I was very sure that that wasn't what was happening, but there was a liberation with it. And then a few months after my mum passed, my relationship ended. Now the grief from that was harder to deal with for me personally than the grief of my mum dying. And now I want to also flag up, there is so much shame and guilt given to us in bundles around how we should or shouldn't experience grief, especially if it's around death. But it was the contrasting in these two experiences of sudden losses, of big losses that I didn't see coming. My mum and my relationship, and very close, sort of, within 3 months of each other, that I got to see two very different types of grief so closely. And that took me to do a lot of research internally and see what experts say, things like that. And what I found most helpful is what I'm going to share with you today. So one of the main things that we're grieving, whether it be a person, a job, a country, a place we lived, is actually what it brought out in us, the aspect of our personality that we feel we were only able to access in that relationship or in that place. So it might be, oh, when I lived in Spain, I was this carefree and it's the sense of freedom and liberation. So you grieve that period in your life, or you grieve that experience because you have bought into some program, some subconscious belief that you can only experience that when you're in Spain. Or, this relationship, I felt completely sexually liberated or, in alignment with my unique sexual expression when I was in that relationship with that person. And so this is what I'm grieving, because I think that's only accessible for me in that partnership. Or I can't get over the fact that I've lost that job because I felt in control, I felt powerful, I felt appreciated, I felt seen, I felt creative. And then now that job's gone, those parts of my, that's not in my life anymore. So when we realize that actually it's an aspect of ourself that we're grieving, that we have somehow given the power away to those people, places, or things, that we can then work out how we can recreate those aspects in ourselves in other environments. And that doesn't diminish or belittle or take away any of the phenomenal experience that relationship, personal place gave you. But it allows you to use it as a key, as a catalyst, and honor it in different ways to move you forward. Because we are only ever in the present moment. And grief is incredibly healthy and incredibly natural and incredibly important, that we don't pretend we don't have grief when we do. Don't pretend we don't have grief when we do. But it's also not a death sentence. It doesn't need to define us, and it's not wrong if that grief changes shape or stops feeling as painful. That doesn't mean you didn't love that person as much. And all of these little stories that we can tell each other, and society is full of, that everything informs everything else. So what this allowed me to make this personal to me is that when I realized that actually, of course, I loved my mum. Of course, I could recognize, what an amazing person she was in her own right. But I also had a really challenging, difficult relationship with her, which I won't go into now why. But essentially, I couldn't speak my truth around her, which meant that I was often, our experiences, especially as adults, was I felt incredibly frustrated. I didn't feel seen. I felt that I had to be a version of myself that wasn't authentic to be with her, to be approved of. And all of this was counter to how I like to be very honest and open and free in the way that I present myself. So when she passed, the grief, the part of myself, if you think about me in relationship to her, I wasn't massively grieving that aspect of myself. It felt a relief for that aspect of myself, for me to not be working with that. Whereas when my relationship ended, with that person, there were so many parts of myself and things that I'd often wanted to experience that only happened for the first time with him, in terms of really feeling, unconditionally loved, for all my faults and, all of those things, and, and X, Y, and Z. And so when that ended, there were huge aspects of myself that I was grieving, that I felt that I had given the power away, thinking that I can only ever experience that version of myself with them. And I found having this realization made it really helpful for me to think about grief and how I navigate grief. And more importantly, just get a big eraser, a big rubber, and get rid of all that guilt and shame about what I should or shouldn't be feeling when I should or shouldn't be experiencing it. And I never really bought into that much, but it really helped me see the difference between the two. If this is resonating at all, because I'm doing quite a lot of maybe too much information, but please put it in the chat. It's lovely to see some of you here live. And if anyone has any questions, that would be, yeah, throw them in. So really, this is the main thing that I wanted to raise, because there's a lot of information around there about grief. And in the autumn, I will be running a 6-week course around grief, because it is such a big topic. And because it is so unspoken about. And because it is the price, you could say the price, because that means it gives it a negative connotation potentially. But the price we pay for loving, when we open our hearts up to love, the power of that energy, we are also opening ourselves up to the realization that everything is transitory in this reality. Nothing is there forever. And so really, grief is like getting a gold star. I don't know if they have those in other countries, but when you're a really little kid and you're at primary school, oh, hi, warrior girl. You get a gold star. You give children gold stars for doing something good, like tidying up or something. So grief really is like the gold star for showing that you've loved, or you've wished or desired or hoped. You know, you start a small business and it doesn't work out, and you grieve that. That shows us we're human. It's the badge of honor to show that we have been brave enough to open our hearts, to love, to want, to get out of our comfort zones, to take risks. And because of that, grief can also be a wonderful learning curve. And it can be especially liberating for people who live very much in the left brain and feel a sense of wanting to control emotions. And because it can come in such unpredictable, more than any other really emotional experience, waves where you can feel totally okay for 3 months and feel like you're over it. If that's, if you're ever over anything, because everything is now, but if you're over it, how much energy it holds when it comes into your environment, really, and then suddenly something pops in. This can be really helpful to think about. What else is anything else I wanted to mention? That it's natural that the more, thank you, Magical Muscles. That's a great name. The other thing that I wanted to mention is why it's so important that we acknowledge and allow ourselves the time and the space as much as possible to go into the grief. And the main reason we don't do that and we shut it down is because grief can be a hugely powerful energy that moves through us, and we can get scared of that and block it down. Now, unprocessed grief is what turns into trauma, which is when it stays very live for us. And in our physical body, that is actually what's happening when we block out emotion. We ain't getting it anywhere unless you process the emotion, unless you consciously witness the emotion and let it move through you, which is the fastest and easiest way to do it. But because we feel the strength of that energy, we underestimate our own power, which is the main problem in life. We underestimate our own power. We give our power away. It's my 2 examples with my mum and my partner. Then this is when we start to go, oh my God, I'll break if I feel this. Shut it down, lock it down, push it inside. And then our body becomes full of this. And this is then where we start to work with addictions, and we start to work with self-sabotage and all of these things to avoid dealing with what we have compounded within the body. And it can also then lead to illness and yada, yada, yada. Essentially, everything is connected. Everything. So what do I recommend is that whenever emotion comes up, generally we ain't trying to suppress laughter, happiness, joy, bliss, euphoria, those things. We're like, oh yeah, great, let's keep this one going. But when it is jealousy, grief, rage, anxiety over all of those things, the things of the lower density, we tend to want to push them under the rug. And unfortunately, under the rug is in our body. And we want energy to be able to move freely through us. This is what all acupuncture is based on, and Tai Chi and yoga. So what can we do is just to go, oh gosh, something's coming up. I don't like the feeling of it. And rather than going into subconscious automatic suppression, which also might result in like unconscious eating or alcohol or drugs or whatever it might be, we go, I'm feeling really angry. I'm feeling really angry. Okay, what does my anger want me to do? It wants me to move my body, or it wants me to go and shout and scream in the forest, or it, wants me to punch the cushions, or it wants me to just, walk out of the office and go to a toilet cubicle and do a very loud silent scream, or whatever it might be, to allow the energy to move through you in a non-destructive way, ideally. Really quite important. And the more conscious we get about this, in fact, the more often we do it, the stronger and easier and quicker it is for it to move, because our bodies learn to deal with it. They learn to know what they're doing, and it moves. So that's what I recommend in terms of. I feel like I lost my tangent then. No, I mentioned one point. Help me out in case I lost anything. I think so. When energy comes up, top tip is so it doesn't turn into trauma, is to feel it and allow it out of the body. And this is why it's so important, so it doesn't become trauma, that we learn to navigate and experience this. This is also why regular exercise and movement is so long-term healthy, and why yoga isn't just about a bum or a six-pack or Tai Chi or anything like that, is that because when we are moving our muscles, and the reason I mention yoga is because it goes, those postures go into the muscle. They're not just working on the exterior, especially something like yin yoga, where you were moving into an energy by surrendering into it. Deeply powerful yin yoga can bring up lots of tears, which is really good, because that's you unlocking the emotion and letting it out. And if crying makes you uncomfortable, or you see it as a weakness, I really recommend doing some work around that, because it is such a strong, deep cleansing. When the tears, they cleanse this emotion, trapped, stored emotion out of us, and it makes us so much lighter and freer. And if you're somebody who finds it really difficult to cry, I recommend breath work. I recommend breath work to anybody. But for me, that is a really fast, quick way into accessing massive storehouse of stuff. And it does it without going into the story of it, which is so helpful, because when we get into story, and what I mean by story is like the narrative around it, that takes us into victim. Like often, this happened to me, and this happened to me, and this happened to me, and isn't it awful? Yes, but we all have awful things happen to us. And the danger of staying in that place is that we don't move out of it, and we then block other better, brilliant, juicy, wonderful opportunities coming to us, because we're taking all the baggage that comes with victimhood, which is, I need other people to help me, that bad things always happen to me, that I'm not strong enough, X, Y, Z. That's not to diminish when atrocities and boundary violations have happened. But if you wear label victim, which is why the word survivor came in and things like that, but even still, I think survivor has connotations as well. It suggests I won't brainstorm into that. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. I feel like that's enough for today. I mean, I've got a course load of things I can talk about with grief. So I just wanted to give you something really practical, accessible. Okay. Should I touch on this? Yes, I will. Okay, great. So just be aware that there is complex grief as well. So if you are somebody who maybe in the past has not dealt with any grief, who locked their emotions down, and you're suddenly finding yourself on a bit of a spiritual awakening or self-development phase, whichever words you want to use, you might be thinking, oh boy, what have I been doing with my life? Not dealing with stuff. How am I ever going to get through that? Complex grief. And I don't want to, and I also just I don't want to put anybody off, because doing the work, as a phrase used in sort of spiritual circles, isn't always worth it. It is always worth it. The only way up into expanded consciousness and higher states of being and more happiness and joy and higher vibrations is through. We have to go through the compounded crap we've put in ourselves that we haven't dealt with in order to find the wisdom, learn the lessons, stop those cycles repeating, find the liberation, all of that stuff. We have to go through it. Sorry, guys, you do. It's part of being a human being. And so complex grief can be triggered when we develop, is basically when we have what's called a maladaptive narrative around the grief. So we're making the grief into something more than just the processing of the grief. For example, hypothetically, one parent dies when I'm 19. I don't have the coping mechanisms or the support to deal with that. So I just lock it down. I go numb. I move on with my life, or I drink my way through it, or whatever it might be. It comes to 35. My second parent dies. And I suddenly find that I'm not only grieving the first parent, but I have all this stored up grief from the other parent that I haven't dealt with. So that would be complex grief. Another version of complex grief. Something happens, and you have lots of other people that you have to care for. So you're not able to go through your own process, or you're very busy organizing a funeral, things like this. Other things that can trigger complex grief, when we have, we start telling ourselves that something was our fault, that we could have done something differently. I believe on one level we choose when we leave the planet. We have soul contracts, things like this. And, if you did or didn't call somebody at a certain time, would not have changed that. So this is when we have a narrative that we tell ourselves, of things. So that stops us purely accessing the grief, because we're also dealing with guilt, shame, and some other story that we're going through. Again, this story word and how unhelpful it can be. Other examples of complex grief. Or when you don't have a conscious awareness of what it is you're grieving, so you feel like you're grieving of something really small or insignificant, but it's actually because it has an energetic link to something else that you're unaware of. This can often relate to things like losing an object, things like that. Okay. Yes. Oh, and reoccurring loss as well. So when you consistently lose things, that also can trigger maladaptive. So like something like having problems with miscarriages, a succession of not being able to find employment, houses constantly falling through, things like this. When we have a consecutive, we can start to move into this will never happen, and it compounds and snowballs and starts to takes us out of the actual logic and thinking anything is possible in the future. We start to predict the future through the huge losses that I've had. Of course, we're human. These things all happen. It's not about blame or beating yourself up or self-flagellation. It's about having some awareness around it so you can take your power back and deal with it as it really is, rather than snowballing it. So that's really what I'm going to go with. If you've suddenly realized that you're carrying around stories and things like that you're ready to let go of, and this is a parcel arriving for me in the middle of my life. How can I buzz this and let it in? Hang on. There we go. How quick was that? Ninja. Funny, how funny. Never happened before. Thanks for bearing with me, people. So, this is something that you could journal around, okay? What griefs are you carrying? Which ones are you ready to release? And we can't spiritually bypass. We can't get rid of grief unless we're ready to drop it, unless we've gone through the acknowledging and the conscious awareness and riding the waves. But when we're carrying around the stories and we're ready to let go of the stories, this is really helpful. Why haven't you released them till now? Why were they serving you? There will be a reason. What will you miss about letting go of this grief? And what are the benefits of letting go of this grief? So there's some ideas for you to journal around. And when we realize that it's part of ourself that we're grieving, that we only experienced in that place, person, with that place, person, or thing, then we can look at how do we recreate that powerful version of myself, that creative version of myself, that free version of myself now. Okay, those are my top tips. If you found this useful, interesting, helpful, please like, subscribe, share. Please join me next week live at 5 on Tuesdays. And I am running a cacao ceremony for the eclipses. So a week on Wednesday. The eclipses are going to be absolutely crazy this year. They're super rare. It's on a super moon in Sagittarius, 5 degrees, where I have Uranus, on the 26th of May. And then the following, follow-up eclipse, which is why it's a season, because it creates this huge portal of energy for us, is on the 11th of June. I'm going to be holding cacao ceremonies on both of those online. You can get tickets from the website hearthealer.co.uk. The first one is up. The second one will be up later today. And you can join me every week with my online community, Midweek Medicine. Tomorrow's session is on every Wednesday. It's on unifying differences. You can sign up for the membership. You can get in the portal. It'd be lovely to see you there. And please feel free to like, subscribe, share. See you next week for some more head to heart living. Lots of love.